So to summarize everything thus far, we have our user form in login mode, and in our test, we have found the email address field and populated it, and then we've also found our password field and populated it as well. So the next step from a user perspective is finding the button to log in, and of course confirming that when we click the button, we see the expected text appear in the component. So just as a reminder, here is our input for the email, here is our input for the password, here is our input for the password confirmation, but that is not currently present because we are not in registration mode. So that brings us to this button right here. Now, this gives us a perfect opportunity to talk a little bit about how React Testing Library works. So the thing worth knowing is that what React Testing Library does is a full mount. What that means is if your component that is being tested, in this case, it's our app component right here, if the component being tested renders any components of its own, any child components, React Testing Library will go through those components and render their content as well. So here, remember, we are rendering a button component, not yet a button HTML element, but a button component. So in order to understand what React Testing Library is going to render here, we need to actually go into this component and see right here that it is, in fact, a valid HTML button element. It's important to note this because this is not the way it's always going to be depending on the component mounting library that you're using. For example, in other libraries for testing, there is a thing called shallow mounting. And what shallow mounting means is when we mount a component, the test will automatically swap out or replace the child components with replacements, what we call mocks, which are basically just substitutes that don't do anything. And the intent there is to decouple the component from its child components to allow the test to live in isolation. More like a unit test where we are truly testing a single component by itself and not worrying about what its children are doing. The advantage of that approach, of course, is whenever we have a pretty complex component hierarchy, right? So for example, imagine you have component A that renders component B, which renders component C, and that renders component D. If you test component A in React Testing Library, you're going to render the entire hierarchy. So if something goes wrong in any of those components, your test might fail, but you might not have as much of a clue where that error is coming from, compared to an approach where you replace or mock out or stub out the children, right? So why does React Testing Library render the complete hierarchy, the complete component tree? Well, remember, the basic design principle of this library is to get as close as possible to the experience that the user will have in the browser. In the browser, the user is not going to replace any child components with fake implementations or basic replacements. The user is going to see the complete component being rendered, no matter how many levels of children it has. So the React Testing Library team follows those same principles. So all that's to say, in our app component, we are rendering a button component, which in turn is rendering a button element. So we can query our final DOM, our final UI, for this element right here, even though it doesn't directly exist within our app component. It exists indirectly, right? Because the app component is rendering the button component as a child, and it's that button component that has this button element. And I realize that might be confusing because you might be looking at a test and saying, hey, where's this thing coming from? I don't see it in the actual JSX. And that will be because the JSX may have another component that has the thing you're looking for. All right. So it's always a matter of trade-offs and advantages and disadvantages as far as the best way to test, right? Because obviously with an approach like this, it can get pretty hairy. It's not that bad when we just have a single child, but if we have 10 levels of components being rendered, it obviously becomes a bit more complicated, and it's hard to determine where we kind of start testing everything. So with that said, the next thing worth knowing is that an HTML button element will automatically have a role of button, okay? It's a little bit confusing because we distinguished between the idea of a role versus an element. For example, an HTML element is an input with a type of text, and that has a role of text box. But there's also going to be cases where there's going to be an HTML element that shares a name with a given role, an accessibility role, an area role, right? So an HTML button also has a role called button as well, right? Because button still describes the value to the user. It's something to be clicked on, right? So as we know in React Testing Library, the recommended way to query, if you're able to, is to query by role. So this method right here, get by role, is going to be able to work for us to get this button right here by its role, which is also coincidentally button. Okay, so that code is going to look like this. We're going to declare a const called submit button. That's what we're looking for. Or maybe login button would even be better, but for now I think this is fine. And we're once again going to use get by role. The first argument is a string with the role we're looking for. We're looking for an element with a role of button. And keep in mind, every element that is a button will have a role of button. So if our page or our component had 20 buttons, then this query would fail because React Testing Library needs just one match. So even though our component under test, the app component, only has one button, it's always a good idea to provide additional configuration options just to make the test more future-proof, just in case we add, let's say, another button tomorrow, right? We want a test to be able to endure as we make changes to our component. So we can be more specific and say, don't just find a button, but find a button with a given property or a given value or attribute. So earlier on, we saw that we can provide a configuration object to the getByRole method. We're going to do the same thing here. And we're once again going to use the name property for that object. And the reason this is interesting is because the name property is going to vary as far as what it represents depending on the element that we're working with. So when we're working with an input field, for example, right here, the name is going to correspond to the label text. When we're working with a button element or an element with a button role, the name is going to correspond with the text on that button. So we're going to say find a button with a given bit of text. And the text here, of course, is a little bit dynamic. It is determined by the state. And if we scroll up, it's coming from the text constant right here. And when we are in login mode, the text should be logged into account. So we're going to tell our test to look for an element with a role of button with the text login to account. And that is exactly how the user is going to navigate the page, right? They're going to look for something they can click with a specific amount or specific value of text on it, right? So right here, we're once again going to use regular expressions. So once again, provide the two forward slashes with an I for case and sensitivity. And here, I'm going to look for the text login into account. Once again, I'm not concerned about the casing. I just want to find a button that has this text. That's the value to the user. All right. I'm going to save this, and you can see our test is passing, which means React Testing Library is not having any issues. It successfully found what we want it to look for, this button right here. Okay. So the next thing we need to do, of course, is not just find the button, but click it. So how are we going to interact with an element? We're once again going to use our user event object. This time around, however, we don't want to type, we want to click. But remember, this object has a whole bunch of methods simulating user actions or user events. And there is an action called click. So we're going to invoke the click method, and the only argument it needs is the element, the HTML DOM element that you want to simulate the user clicking. So of course, we have that saved in our submit button constant above. And there we go. So now we are rendering our app. We are filling out the email and the password and typing, or clicking rather, the submit button, the button with the text login to account. So once again, I can invoke the debug method on screen. And now in theory, since the submission of the form should trigger our form logic right here, which should update the value of the message state property to have this thing, we should now see the text "you are now logged in" our UI. And if I scroll up in this output, we see that this text is now present as it is expected to be, right? That is the message that appears below the button when the user provides their email and password and clicks the button, right? So in our HTML output here, we can see that the component is working as expected, but we don't actually have any assertion yet in our test to validate that. So in the next lesson, we're going to write our actual assertion after all of this setup to validate that this text is present within our UI. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.